Welcome in to another episode of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we have a lot to discuss, actually. So first things first, I want to apologize. I know I've not recorded an episode in about 2 weeks. Obviously, with Alabama's loss to Duke, I was going to do a breakdown episode and just didn't end up doing it. I had a lot of things going on in my personal life and just didn't get around to recording it. I'm really sorry about that. I am going to talk about that in this episode. I know we are in the middle of transfer portal season. I will cover every transfer that Alabama's got. My plan is to do segments on each individual transfer, what I think that they're going to play, what role they're going to play in our system. I am waiting on that. I know a lot of this is very fluid, so sometimes it's a situation where players are leaving and we think they may stay, or staying and we think they may leave. So I am going to talk about in this episode the players which are going to be for sure staying and for sure leaving on next year's Alabama team, but I'm not going to talk about any of the new incoming transfers because all of that is super fluid. The last thing I want to mention is I actually have some news that's going to be upcoming. It probably is going to be announced next week. I've been in talks and I may be potentially doing some stuff as it relates to this podcast. For you, the listener, nothing changes, right? Everywhere you get your podcast today, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, that stays exactly the same. Nothing changes for you guys at all. But there may be a partnership that I'm able to enter into that potentially gives me, some additional credibility, as well as gives me some additional media resources and potentially some other podcast opportunities where, I could potentially partner with other podcasts as it relates to a show, like before the Alabama-Auburn game, I partner with an Auburn show or something like that, right? So there is some additional media potential availability that's going to come with this. So I would like to let you guys in on it. Everything is not finalized. There's still a few things we need to finish out as it relates to that, but I hope to be able to come to you next week with the official information. So thank you so much as always for the support. It was not for you guys. If it was not for the audience that we have, these podcast platforms would not be reaching out. So I really do appreciate the support. So let's do the Duke preview or Duke breakdown. I'll talk about what happened in that game, what went wrong. We'll talk a little bit about Florida winning the national title and what I think it means for Alabama kind of moving forward. Obviously, Florida taking down Alabama, I think a lot of that had to do with Walter Clayton and just how good he is as a player. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll close the show out with talking about what our roster looks like today. Again, this is only going to be from a end of 24-25 season. Who on last year's roster do we know for sure is staying or for sure is leaving, right? That's who we're going to talk about. Then we will, over the summer and over the next week or so, some of the next episodes that you get out of me are going to be breakdowns of some of the guys who have committed. But the reason I'm waiting on that is the transfer portal, as of the time of this recording, is still open. So I don't want to kind of do that preemptively. And obviously last season we had guys commit all the way through like June and July. So that's going to be kind of fluid throughout the rest of the summer. So we'll talk about that and then we'll get going. So first things first, like I said, we're going to talk about the Duke game. Obviously it's long behind us at this point. I've been able to kind of sit back and look at the game as a whole and see what went wrong, what went right. And simply put, I was under the impression that Alabama was going to be able to kind of control what it needed to control from an offensive standpoint. And I felt like Alabama definitely was able to do a lot of those things. But Duke's length on defense was a major issue for us. Their length on offense, I thought, would potentially be a bigger issue because you have, much bigger guards going up against some of our smaller guards. And honestly, Alabama was okay from a defensive perspective. We held Duke to 85 points. And if you paid attention to Alabama this season, 85 points, usually was not enough to beat us. And, Alabama gets 9 steals in the game, which ends up being more than Duke. But it was just a standpoint of Duke's length and recovery on defense was absolutely incredible. The guy who made a huge impact in this game, Kaman Malawach, actually basically had no impact in the Houston game. Houston, the next game in the Final Four, kind of showed what it looked like to take the physicality to Duke. Houston did a very, very good job and got Duke completely out of its momentum, ended up winning that game. Alabama just was not able to do that, right? Alabama, when you look at Cliff versus Malawach, Cliff gets just 2 rebounds. Malawach gets 9, right? For reference, in that Houston game, I think Malawach had 0 rebounds, right? This was the standpoint is this was a huge piece of this game is that Alabama honestly got destroyed on the glass. From a defensive rebounding standpoint, Duke had 34 to Alabama's 20, right? It was a huge issue in this game. Obviously, Duke was fairly efficient from the floor and hit some shots, and Alabama couldn't make a ton of shots. A lot of that is credit to Duke, but the rebounding was the difference in this game. I did not think that it would be. I thought that Alabama would be able to hold its own because we've seen this time and time and time again, right? Alabama was able to do it against A&M. Alabama was able to do it against St. Mary's. Alabama was able to do it kind of throughout the course of the season against some of the better rebounding teams. But to Duke's credit, they played in a really, really good game. They were able to do what they needed to do from a defensive rebounding perspective and have that length so that even if they had a blow by, the recovery from a defensive perspective was very, very good for Duke. And Alabama honestly was just never able to recover. The rebounding was the difference in this game. Obviously, with Alabama being able to speed it up a little bit, a lot of that's predicated on us getting the rebound and get out and go. But when you get out rebounded by 11, that's a major issue. Then when you look at like an assist number, Alabama has 14 assists, which is great. Duke has 19. And just overall, it really felt like Duke was able to take over the game and pretty quickly you knew, hey, this game is over. I wish that Alabama could have been able to do a little more, but it was very, very clear pretty quickly that the length that Duke had was giving us a ton of troubles on offense. Mark Sears had a poor game, to say the absolute minimum. He goes 1 of 7 from 2, 1 of 5 from 3, 1 of 3 from the line. He does have 6 assists, but, has a very poor game with 5 turnovers. A lot of that has to do with the length that Duke put on him and what they forced him to do. A lot of that is just Duke, again, getting bigger, getting longer. And that's something that as we continue through the offseason and talk about what Alabama has looked to do with the team moving forward, that's something you're going to hear Alabama do a lot more, right? Alabama needs to get a little bigger, a little longer, because from a defensive perspective and from an offensive perspective, it just gives you so much more versatility for how Nate Oates wants to play his system. But the bigger thing being from that defensive perspective, right? Again, Duke's offense was good. I'm not saying it wasn't, but it was not an offense that was some crazy thing that was giving us a ton of problems. It was really more just Duke's defense was stopping us at every turn. And so then their offense could just play normal, efficient basketball. And they finish with a 1.16, and it's more than sufficient because they hold Alabama to a 0.89 points per possession, right? Substantially below our season average, substantially below what you typically are seeing out of Alabama. And like I said, it was all predicated on that length that Duke put on the floor, right? When the smallest guy that Duke is running out there is like a 6'5 guard in Caleb Foster, and all their starters are 6'6 Proctor, 6'6 Sian James, right? You just have a really big roster out there. And when you compare it to Alabama, who was playing 3 guys under 6'4", just a major difference, right? When you look at who Alabama is bringing in and who we're recruiting and such, length is a huge deal that Alabama's looking at, right? From our incoming freshmen to the incoming transfers and such, the number one thing that Alabama is looking for is length, right? That is the big thing that you're going to hear out of Alabama fans and Alabama people talking about this upcoming team is how much bigger, longer, and more physical Alabama wants to be from a defensive perspective, because I personally feel that Nate Oates is able to get the offense to where he needs it to be. The defense is the question, and if the defense is the question, let's recruit and scout from a defensive perspective, and then we can get the offense how we need to do it, right? So I think that's the route that they're going in this case, and I think that that's going to be super successful and going to give us some more versatility on defense, where Alabama doesn't just have to win a game by outscoring somebody, because this season, even though the defense was much better than it was last season, we still, at most times felt like we had to outscore people. Definitely not as bad as it was last season, but there were times where you really felt like you had to outscore somebody in order to be successful in a game, right? So getting longer on defense, getting the more physical guys, a little bit bigger guards is something that they want to do, and that's something that you're definitely seeing as Alabama, looks at people in the transfer portal. So that's when we're talking about. Like I said, this Duke game definitely, I think is going to help catapult Alabama in how they're going to recruit and how they're going to look at talent moving forward. Obviously, it hurts to see the loss. I do feel like Duke was just a better team. I thought that Duke would probably win it all. I thought that Duke had the talent and the group to be able to win it all. I think, honestly, don't want to pin it on a single player, but I thought that how poor Kaman Malawach played in that Houston game, he was legitimately nearly unplayable. He's a minus 20 from the field. I think it honestly probably cost Duke the game. Obviously, there were some other players that missed some shots, but I think that was as big a deal. It ended up costing Duke the game, which ends up making a Florida Final Four, and just a really heartbreaking way for Houston to lose the game, for Florida to win a national title. Obviously, really cool to see. We knew Florida was a very, very good team. I personally thought Duke was the best team that I saw all year, especially for how they played against Alabama. I thought that Florida was very good, but I thought that Duke did some things from a defensive perspective that were just absolutely incredible, which is why I thought that they would be able to have a little bit more success. I thought that Duke's offense, wasn't going to get out of sorts against Houston. It did. But that is the big thing for me is, I thought that Florida was a very good team, obviously a very well-balanced team, and that ends up helping them win the national title. Being able to do just different things on the floor, was able to withstand some really good runs from Houston, and Florida wins the national title, right? So that's what happened, obviously, in the Final Four, Elite Eight, with Alabama's loss, and then Florida going on to win it all. So we're going to move on. We're going to talk a little bit about the players that have left Alabama. I know this is going to be a little bit shorter episode, but we're going to talk a little bit about those players, and then we'll get out of here. So when we look at Alabama's roster and who was on our roster this last season and who is no longer going to be in our roster moving forward, there's going to be a lot of changes, right? Some of the changes are super obvious. We expected those changes coming into the season, right? You have guys like Mark Sears, Chris Youngblood, Cliff Amore, Grant Nelson, all entering the NBA draft. They are out of eligibility, nothing that we can do about those. We knew that those guys were going to be gone, and that was fully expected coming into the year. LeBaron Philon entered his name into the NBA draft as well, and he is a guy that we had heard a lot about potentially returning to college. Officially, he has not 100% said he's not coming back, but everything that I have heard sounds like he is gone. His statement sounded like, "Hey, I'm ready to start my next step." From what I heard, he actually hired an agent that would allow him to come back should he want to, but I really don't think that that's going to be the case. I really expect that he's going to get a late first round grade and going to stay in that NBA draft, which is more power to him, right? Nate Oates often will meet with the players and talk to them. And this is something that really helps us, right? When LeBaron Philon makes this decision and decides, "Hey, I'm going to stay," what that does is that doesn't put us in the situation that we had with Chuck, a couple of years ago, right? Alabama was fully expecting Chuck to come back because he wasn't getting a first round grade. And kind of typically the way Nate does these is, you go meet with the NBA, you do the draft, combine, etc. And then if you get the first round grade, he of course wants you to stay if you get a first round promise. However, if you get the second round or an undrafted promise, the expectation in most cases that you would come back. The expectation with Chuck is that he was going to come back, and then he ends up staying in the draft, which is the reason why Alabama had to go out and get like Muhammad Wagi, which was not the player that we were wanting to get back. It was more of we wanted Chuck back. And so when you have a guy like LeBaron Philon that does go ahead and put his name in the draft, and make it official, like, hey, I'm going to be in the draft. This is what I plan to do. What it does is it frees up some NIL capital for you, right? Alabama doesn't just have to put money aside on the expectation that, hey, if LeBaron Philon comes back, we're going to need a fairly large NIL chunk for him because he's an elite player, right? Somebody that's around that, even round 2 draft capital. They're going to be, a starter in the Power 5. Like, you need a decent NIL chunk for them. So he is somebody that that doesn't have to happen because of how he made this announcement. An additional thing is you also can go to other star point guards and talk to them and say, hey, there is, we don't have somebody else on the table, right? We don't have some other guy that's planning to come in that is afraid of LeBaron Philon coming back, right? Whether you're talking to a Cedric Coward or, previously a Jerron Pierre, or the different guys who Alabama's kind of talked throughout this process. And we will see who Alabama ends up landing. But the lead guards that you talk to, Alabama has to make sure that they have the available has to make sure they have the spot available, right? Because some of these guys are going to be afraid to come back if they think LeBaron Philon potentially is going to come back. It just can scare people off because they're worried about the potential starting spot of a guy who's been there the year before, right? A couple of guys that have announced they will be returning, however, right? You have some other guys that then announced, hey, we're coming back. The guys that have announced we're coming back, Aiden Holloway, Aiden Sherrill, Houston Millette, Latrell Wrightsell, all 4 of those guys have announced they're coming back. That's great to hear. That's really, really good to hear. The guys who I haven't mentioned to this point have actually all mentioned that they're going to the transfer portal. Some of these are surprising. Some of these are not. Jaron Stevenson is a guy who, Nate Oates really likes, has loved the whole time he's been here. Nate was kind of enamored with the idea of a 6'11", 3 in our system. We tried him at the 3 a few times this year. It just really never worked out. It really felt like it was a mental block for Jaron. If he ever could just kind of flip the switch and get that attacking mentality, it really felt like he was going to have what it took. But unfortunately, it never really worked out. I fully expect him to go back to North Carolina. Obviously being a legacy at UNC, that's, I expect him to be in the state of North Carolina next season. I understand it. It's not something that I feel bad about, but that is one where completely makes sense, why he would enter the portal. Is somebody that I thought, had some potential, and there's a reason, obviously, that he started and played a substantial amount for us. We'll never forget what he did against Clemson to get us to the Elite Eight, right? Forever respect for that. But, that is a guy that ends up entering the transfer portal. Another guy that enters the transfer portal that wasn't a full, huge surprise was Darion Reed. Darion Reed is a guy who, if you followed his recruitment, it was messy at the very minimum. His family is very involved in his recruiting process, and a lot of reports are that his family was not super happy with Nate Oates, even throughout the recruiting process. And, there's some question marks as to the validity and the intensity of his injury. We will see, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that. But I will say that at a bare minimum, his family and his agency played some role in this leave of Alabama, right? Some of the reports are Darion really likes Alabama. Some of the reports are there's some skepticism there. I've heard a lot of different things as it relates to that, but nevertheless, he did enter the transfer portal. I would not expect him to be back. This is a situation where I expect probably Georgia, North Carolina State, some of the schools like that to potentially be involved. I know Georgia is a school that his family really liked coming out, and obviously being from the state of Georgia, that would not surprise me even a little bit. And then the last guy is probably the most controversial to have entered the portal, and it's Mohamoud Diabate, a guy that we have talked very positively about on this show. We have talked very positively about in my threads, over the course of this last 2 years, have talked very, very positively about. He's a guy that's, been a glue guy for Alabama. He's done all the right things from a blue-collar perspective and has honestly been a very stalwart on the team. His reason for leaving the university is purely a money decision. And I can't fault the guy for money, right? I'm not going to sit here and say as a professional, right? I do other things for a living that if I was offered more money to do the same job, that I would not potentially take that, right? I cannot get mad at him for doing that. But that's what ended up happening in this case, right? This was a situation where, from the reports that I have heard, Hamidi Abate was offered a certain amount with Alabama. He agreed in principle to that amount, never signed the deal. His agency, had gotten offers from some other teams, came back to renegotiate with Alabama. Alabama kind of held firm, tried to renegotiate on a couple of occasions, and then eventually entered the transfer portal. Signing with Kentucky, right? Originally, we had thought that he was potentially going to be signing with like a St. John's or somebody up from the upper Northeast, back where he's from. However, Kentucky ends up, being the landing spot, and all the reports that I have heard have been this was like I said, almost an entirely a money decision. Because from a scheme fit, it doesn't exactly make sense, right? Mohamed Abate, obviously a physical guy, so right, if Kentucky's looking for, hey, we want to get the physicality, it makes sense from the Kentucky side of things. What it doesn't make sense from is the Mohamed Abate side of things, right? Obviously, he brings them the physicality, but what do they bring him in their style of offense, right? Maybe you're looking at, he shot 40% for three, but he shot 46% from three, but he shot 26 threes all year, right? He was 12 of 26. He was not a high volume guy. He is not a guy that's going to be one that you want to shoot 60 threes a year. So I'm not exactly sure on the fit standpoint from that point. Like I said, I'm not going to shame the guy. If you want to make more money and do the same job, by all means, do it, right? Again, as somebody who's in the business world, I fully understand it. I am not upset by it, but that is kind of the facts and the reality of the situation. Is this was one that Nate and staff did try to retain, but matching the number that he was offered by Kentucky just didn't make sense from an Alabama NIL perspective. Alabama obviously does have a decent NIL, war chest, if you want to call it such, for basketball. It's not at the level of a Kentucky or a Duke or somebody like that, but it is a substantial amount. I've heard top 5-ish in the SEC. So it is an amount that is very capable of getting top talent. But if you're talking about allocating resources, the amount that Kentucky allocated for a guy that does very good things for us, but also plays a certain role in our system that potentially would not be expanding just due to his offensive skill set, is something that just didn't make sense for Alabama to match that offer. So best of luck to him at Kentucky. Alabama will play them obviously this year, and we will see how that works out. But that is a guy that has already committed. Like I said, Mohamed Abate has committed to Kentucky. That's kind of the situation and how that one went. It was one that Nate did try to retain. Like I said, we gave a very competitive offer up front that apparently, like I said, based on some of my sources and what I have heard, sounds like he may have agreed to in principle, and then decide not to move forward with signing said contract. So that's kind of how the roster as of the current moment looks like. So if you're talking about the guys on our roster today, and we're not talking about the transfers, I'm going to have a whole different episode, and we're going to break down transfers in their own episode. But as of the current guys on the roster today that we knew kind of from last year's team plus the incoming freshmen, we've got Houston Millette, we've got Latrell Reitzel, we've got Aiden Holloway, we've got Aiden Sherrill, right? Those are your four big guys. One last guy that entered the transfer portal was Nas Cunningham. The reason I didn't mention him, if you kind of followed the show or have listened to anything I've done, that one was one we fully expected to kind of happen as soon as the transfer portal opened. I've heard some reports he may end up coming back. I don't know the validity of that. It may be true, may not, but I would not expect it to happen unless he's kind of into the bench. He didn't find a better spot, so you're going to come back to Alabama and just try to keep working and see what you can do. If that ends up being the case, more power to him, but he is one that did enter the portal. We will see where he ends up at as well. But right, the guys who we do have coming back are Houston Millette, Aiden Sherrill, Aiden Holloway, and then Latrell Reitzel. Then you do have the three incoming guys that you have already signed from Davion Hannah, Amari Allen, and London Jemison. So as of this very moment, that's what your roster looks like. I fully expect some additional transfer portal stuff to come through. Kind of a sneak preview of that is Alabama has already got commitments from Noah Williamson, Jalil Bethia, and Taylor Bowen. So Noah Williamson from being a 7-foot center from Bucknell. You have Taylor Bowen, the 6'11 forward from Florida State, and then Jalil Bethia, a 5-star or previous 5-star 6'5 guard from Miami. Bethia, a guy we really wanted last season. Miami outbid us from an NIL perspective. Alabama's able to kind of get the commitment of a really, really talented sharpshooter that we tried to get last season. So that's who we've already got, right? So the roster's up to 10 guys at this point. The 4 returners we talked about, the three freshmen we discussed, and then the 3 transfers that have already committed. There are other transfers I fully expect to happen. I'm not sure how many roster spots we plan to fill. I fully expect at least 1 to 2 more guys. I'm not sure how many roster spots Nate's going to look to fill with the roster actually opening up 2 more spots. I've not heard if the SEC is fully opening those roster spots or how that's going to work out, but Alabama has plenty of spots to work with. Alabama has a few things that they still need to fill. The number 1 spot right now is a lead guard, so that's what they're looking at from like a Cedric Coward perspective. He's the current target that we've heard the most about. As of this moment of this recording, it's between Alabama and Duke, so we will see how that ends up working out if Alabama is able to close out and get Cedric Coward from Washington State. So that's currently what the outlook looks like from a transfer perspective. As I said, we'll talk much more about the transfer portal after the close of the transfer portal, and hopefully on the next episode I will also have the information about the potential partnership that I'm going to be entering into from an audio podcast perspective. So anybody that listens over on Apple and Spotify, nothing will change for you guys, but there may be some additional stuff that's coming that I will let you guys know about once that takes place. So thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I really appreciate all the support on this. Like I said, I would not be able to even have these discussions if it was not for everybody listening, watching, commenting, subscribing. So if you do appreciate the content that I have, please put it down in the subscription. I really would appreciate it. If you have any questions, anything at all, throw it down in the comments. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.